type of work did your mother and father do?
My mother was just a housewife through the years when I was growing up. As I said, we lived out in the country, 7 miles outside the village, and she just stayed there taking care of the house and putting up with me and keeping loose ends together. And my dad was an assistant cashier in a bank in Brooklyn. Neither one of them went to college, by the way. Neither one did. Colleges were kind of a luxury back at that time. To be able to go to college, it was a luxury.
Did you guys do any farming or anything like that on the property, or?
No, we had 7 acres of land that had been given to my father by his father, who lived in a big house up on the hill right next door, and that's pretty much where I spent my childhood, up at Grandpa's house. So I was closely connected with farming. I had a cousin that I thought of very highly, and he was a little older than me. He was a teenager, and he lived with my grandmother and grandfather, and he did most of the farming for them. So I spent my time out in the field with him, and I was close to farming all the time, but never a part of it, really.
What kind of work and hobbies did you do?
Throughout my life, you mean? Really, as far as work is concerned, I did not have much in the way of additional work experience. As I mentioned previously, I worked 2 years in that shoe factory I mentioned. I worked a year before I went in the service, and then I worked a year there when I came back from the service. And that was about all of the work experience that I had until, and I don't know why, as I said, I thought I wanted to go into business. I wanted to be a banker or an insurance man or work as an administrator in a business, something like that. That was kind of my goal. And that was true when I went into the service. But when I came back, I was as sure I wanted to be a teacher as if it were written out in blueprint form for me. And what brought that about, I don't know till this day. It was just something that magnetized within me during that period of time. It was a service, and when I went to Wilmington and entered in up there, was never any question on mine. Well, what are you going to major in? I knew from the day one, I want to be in education. Haven't had a whole lot of hobbies. If I could classify anything as a hobby, it would have to be my love of sports. I've just been interested in sports all of my life. As I said, I coached for a number of years, coached basketball and baseball. I played amateur baseball was very popular right after the war. There wasn't any TV for people to watch, so they had what they call home teams, you know, and leagues of players and fellows that come back from the military, and each town had its team and they had a league, and gosh, I did that for I don't know how many years. And then after I stopped playing baseball, after I got too old to do that, I played softball for a number of years. They had softball leagues over here. There was an intense interest in slow pitch softball here in Bethel. And there were leagues. There was a women's league. There were 2 leagues for men. And there were games over there every night. Our kids practically grew up at the ballpark because my wife played softball. I played softball. And usually played at least 2 nights a week. Well, when you're in the ballpark, what do you do with the kids? Come on, kids, we're going to the ballpark. And they met many of their friends, and they had a great time over at the ballpark. Of course, they all had a refreshment stand too, so they visited pretty often, as you could well imagine. But, and, you know, as I've gotten older, I've maintained that interest in, and now I follow Major League Baseball very closely, and I like college basketball and the Bengals a little bit, not too much.
It's rough, yeah.
But it was interesting that our son, he graduated from here in 1969. He played on that football team that was unbeaten here at Bethel in 1968. But he made up his mind when he was a sophomore that he wanted to go into sports management. And he never changed it. He went through college and got his degree at Wittenberg, and then went to Ohio U and got his master's in sports management. So I think the interest that I had and the background that he had being around sports all the time while I was coaching and such, it kind of became one of his favorite things to do too. But I haven't had any hobbies like antiques or automobiles or horses or anything like that. When I was working, I didn't have time for stuff like that. I just didn't. I was coaching, and as I said, I drove a bus for 7 years and with the teaching, and then I went into administration. I was a junior high principal here for 2 years, and I went to Claremont Northeastern as a middle school principal for 5 years over there. And I worked for the county service center for 2 years as an associate superintendent in the county. And then I came back here for 13 years, my last 13 years as superintendent here in Bethel. So I had all I needed without having any hobbies that taken much of my time.
What was Bethel like when you first moved here? Like schools, transportation, entertainment?
Good question. Good question. Let's see what I want to talk about first. Let's talk about school transportation first of all. Not a whole lot different from what it is now. I forget how many buses were being operated at that time. And a lot of the routes today are pretty much the same as they were then. It was the same road, you know. If you were familiar with the roads around Bethel, roads haven't changed. And of course, for school bus needs back then to cover those roads, and same thing exists today. So in all those years, that hasn't changed a whole lot. The one thing that I would say was a big change is kids driving to school. Kids did not drive to school back then. They didn't have the cars. Very few of them did. There were a small number, maybe, that had cars to drive to school. But
So even at the driving age?
Even at the driving age, yes. Yeah. Even your high school kids rode the bus. There were a few of them that drove, but and that, you know, gradually increased. But transportation wasn't that different. The buses weren't as large, they weren't as powerful. There wasn't any messing around on school buses. I hear a lot from various sources today with all the discipline problems that there are on school buses. And that situation did not exist back then. I mean, the driver told you to sit down in your seat and be quiet. You sat down in your seat and was quiet. If you didn't, you wouldn't be on that bus very long. All it took was a word from the driver to the principal and a telephone call from the principal to the parents, and that was the situation. Now that is a lot of different today because there's a lot of judicial work that you have to go through, and these rights of appeals and hearings, and you'll end up with a stack of papers that high to get a kid put off a bus now. It's a real task, so it's different in that respect. Other transportation, not nearly as much as there is now. People were more confined to this area. There were more jobs. There weren't as many people. There were people working in Cincinnati in the fringe areas and various other locations, but not nearly as many people would drive to Westchester. There weren't any Westchesters or Eastgates even. Eastgate was just a place to go through on your way to downtown Cincinnati. And there just weren't as many automobiles, and of course the automobiles that were there weren't nearly as numerous, they weren't as fast, they weren't as high priced as automobiles are today. So it was a gradual change, and there weren't as many cars in each family. Usually only one car in a family, unless both the man and the wife were working. And then they might buy a very cheap car when Junior got to be 16 years old and needed an automobile, you know. But cars, traffic, it wasn't as dangerous to drive back then as it is now. And we didn't have any 275s with 6 or 8 lanes of traffic and people driving bumper to bumper 75 and 80 miles an hour. That you know, there might have been when 275 opened, I think maybe there were 2 lanes each direction. And you know, the speed limit on there was about, I think, 60 back then, not nearly as many automobiles, so it was a lot safer to travel than it is today.